Evan Davis leaned back into the soft leather seat of his brand-new Lexus, the smooth jazz notes on the radio wrapping him in a cocoon of calm. The car's polished dashboard gleamed under the fading sunlight, and the faint scent of new leather filled the air, a subtle reminder of his well-earned success. It had been a long, grueling day at the courthouse, where he had presided over cases that tested his patience, judgment, and empathy. But now, driving through the serene, tree-lined streets of Maplewood, Michigan, he felt the day's weight slowly lifting off his shoulders. Maplewood was home, a sanctuary of sprawling homes, manicured lawns, and quiet neighbors. This peaceful neighborhood represented everything Evan had worked so hard to achieve. For him, this drive wasn't just a journey home. It was a moment of gratitude and reflection. As he turned onto the final stretch toward his house, he couldn't help but admire the stillness of the evening. The golden light filtering through the trees painted a picture of tranquility. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, a safe space. But tonight, that sense of safety would be challenged in ways Evan could never have anticipated. A flash of blue and red lights in the rearview mirror shattered his peace. His heart skipped a beat as the unmistakable wail of a police siren followed. Evan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his mind racing through the possibilities. He hadn't been speeding. In fact, he had been driving leisurely, well under the limit. What could this possibly be about? Pulling over to the side of the road, Evan kept his movements deliberate and calm. As a judge, he knew the importance of staying composed, especially in situations like these. Yet, despite his knowledge of the law and his position, he couldn't shake the nagging unease creeping into his chest. The sharp knock on his window startled him. He turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered police officer staring down at him, her face stern and unreadable. Her uniform was crisp, and her badge gleamed under the fading sunlight. Her nameplate read, Officer Miller, but her posture spoke louder than her title. "License and registration," she demanded, her voice clipped and devoid of pleasantries. Evan nodded politely, reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve the documents. He moved carefully, aware of the growing tension. Handing over the papers, he attempted to maintain eye contact, hoping for even a flicker of recognition. But Officer Miller didn't so much as glance at him. She snatched the documents and scanned them quickly, her brows furrowing as her gaze darted between the papers and Evan. "Step out of the car," she ordered abruptly, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. Evan blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "Out. Now," she repeated, her tone sharp and unyielding. For a moment, Evan hesitated. He was no stranger to authority or confrontation, but this was different. The implications of this moment were clear. She didn't see him as a judge, a community member, or even a person with a valid explanation. To her, he was merely a suspect. "Officer, I think there's been some misunderstanding," Evan began, keeping his tone measured. "I'm Judge Evan Davis. This is my car, and I live just down the street." Her expression didn't change. If anything, her gaze hardened, and her hand inched closer to the gun holstered at her side. "Step out now," she repeated, her words biting. Swallowing his rising indignation, Evan slowly opened the car door and stepped out. The officer's eyes followed his every move, as if expecting him to bolt. He stood beside his car, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. Officer Miller began circling him, her steps slow and deliberate. "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen last week," she said coldly, her tone making it sound less like an explanation and more like an accusation. Evan's jaw tightened. "This is my car. I purchased it from the dealership less than a week ago. If you run the plates, they'll confirm that." But she didn't seem interested in his explanation. "Hands on the hood," she snapped. Evan took a deep breath, his patience fraying at the edges. "Officer, this is unnecessary. I've done nothing wrong." Her eyes glinted, a mixture of suspicion and something darker. "You're going to do as I say, or we'll have a problem," she warned, her voice sharp and unyielding. Evan clenched his fists at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to assert his authority, to remind her who he was. But he knew better. He knew how quickly things could escalate, how easily this situation could spiral out of control. With a deep breath, he complied, placing his hands on the hood of his car. The metallic chill of the car's surface seeped into his palms, a stark contrast to the warmth of the evening. He felt the eyes of his neighbors on him, curtains twitching, unseen faces peeking out to watch the unfolding drama. The humiliation stung more than anything else. Evan had spent a lifetime building his reputation, earning the respect of his peers and his community. But in this moment, none of that mattered. To Officer Miller, he was just another suspect. The cold metal of the car's hood pressed against Evan's palms as he stood there, hands splayed out, his composure unraveling with each passing second. Behind him, Officer Miller's boots crunched against the pavement as she moved. Her presence was suffocating, her movements calculated, and her tone devoid of any empathy. "We've had reports of car thieves in the area," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week." Evan turned his head slightly, his jaw clenched tightly. "I've already explained, officer. This is my car. I purchased it just a few days ago. If you'd run the plates—" "Save it for the station," she interrupted sharply, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her belt. The metallic clink of the cuffs was a harsh reminder of just how precarious his situation had become. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, Evan felt the sharp sting of indignation rise to the surface. But he forced himself to swallow it down. This wasn't the place or time to lose his temper, no matter how justified his frustration was. He knew better than most how quickly misunderstandings could spiral into something far worse. "Officer," he began again, his voice calm but firm, "I strongly suggest you call your superior before taking this any further. I am Judge Evan Davis, and this is my car. You're making a mistake." For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed Officer Miller's face. Her hand, which had been hovering above the cuffs, wavered slightly, but the hard set of her jaw returned as she scoffed. "You expect me to just take your word for it," she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "I expect you to do your job properly," Evan replied evenly, his gaze unwavering. The tension crackled in the air between them, a palpable force that seemed to press down on everything around them. Finally, with a huff of frustration, she reached for her radio and muttered into it. Her eyes remained fixed on Evan, as if daring him to make a wrong move. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Evan stood there, his hands still on the car, his mind racing. This wasn't just an insult to him personally. It was an insult to everything he represented. As a judge, he had spent years fighting for justice, for fairness, for the very principles that seemed to be absent in this moment. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, hidden behind the safety of their curtains. He wondered what they were thinking. Were they shocked? Concerned? Or had they already jumped to the same conclusion Officer Miller had, that he didn't belong here, that he couldn't possibly be the owner of a car like this? The voice crackled over the radio, breaking the heavy silence. "Miller, stand down immediately," the voice commanded. There was an edge of urgency in the tone that made Evan's pulse quicken. Officer Miller's brow furrowed as she listened. "Judge Davis is a respected member of the community. I'm on my way," the voice added. The color drained from Officer Miller's face, and she took a step back, her posture stiff. Evan straightened, dropping his hands from the car, but the sting of humiliation lingered. He could see the shift in her expression, embarrassment, perhaps, or the realization of just how badly she had miscalculated. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of what had just occurred hanging heavily in the air. But Evan wasn't going to offer her an easy way out. "Do you have any further questions for me, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but pointed. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say. Finally, she shook her head, mumbling something that sounded like an apology, though it lacked the sincerity he deserved. Moments later, another police car pulled up, and a man in a crisp uniform stepped out. It was Chief Reynolds, someone Evan recognized immediately. The chief's face was a mixture of concern and anger as he approached. "Judge Davis," he said, his tone apologetic, "I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. I assure you, this will be dealt with." Evan nodded curtly but didn't respond. What could he say? Apologies wouldn't erase what had just happened. The humiliation, the suspicion, the feeling of being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of someone who was supposed to protect and serve. As Chief Reynolds turned to speak to Officer Miller in hushed tones, Evan's mind began to race. This wasn't just about him. How many others had been treated this way, without the privilege of a title or a reputation to shield them? How many times had justice failed the people it was supposed to protect? When he finally got back into his car, the leather seat no longer felt like a comfort. The smooth jazz on the radio couldn't drown out the thoughts swirling in his mind. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Evan knew that this experience was more than just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger, systemic issue that needed to be addressed. And as he drove away from the scene, his resolve hardened. He wasn't just going to let this go. The fight for justice had always been his calling, but now it had become personal.